I think that's the most beautiful thing, the most loving thing. And why does the surface structure keep on changing? Let's just reiterate that again if I didn't make that point clear. Why does the surface structure keep on changing? Because it is being worked upon, impacted by the Christ. We've already seen, well, what is the Christ? It's the fact that the principle is dynamic, that the principle has an idea, you see. And so the principle at the deep structure is dynamically impacting every level of phenomena, every level of surface phenomena, in such a way as to overturn it, and to bring out as a final form the coincidence with the deep structure, coincidence with the true structure. And if you know from the textbook what Mrs. Eddy says about the Christ, especially in the highest teaching that she gives in the platform, where she gives the teaching of divine science, she brings out there that the Christ is all to do with the coincidence, that the Christ is that which is establishing the coincidence between God and man. And that's what the Church of Christ is working out. So can you see that church is a state of consciousness? That your concept of church, your perception of church, is a state of consciousness. And the only crisis is that one which comes from trying to hold on to that which is outgrown, to a concept of church which is outgrown. And the Christ is breaking that down. The Christ science is breaking that down. So that if there is a state of consciousness that is not fully developed, not very advanced, not progressive, not dynamic, and it tends to want to hold back to an old form, to keep an old form, to shore up an old form, an old stage, a former stage, it is not allowed to do that. It is not allowed to do that. Why? Because this is the Church of Christ. It's a terrific thing. Because when you touch the Christ, you touch the whole dynamic of being. You touch the whole fact that, you see, the principle of Christian Science is the principle, the infinite principle. It is the principle of everything. And therefore, if we see that the Christ is the dynamic of that principle, if the Christ means that that principle is not static, is not asleep, is not unmoving, but is constantly manifesting itself, then that Christ is the dynamic that is at work in everything, absolutely everything. I love that. I can't help but bring that in, although it's much further on in my talk, to see that that Christian Science and the principle of Christian Science cannot be confined, cannot be contained within the walls of the Mother Church. It cannot be confined and contained within the little denomination of Christian Scientists, a little field of Christian Scientists. But it is a universal principle. Christian Science is alive and well and living in the world. Wake up. Wake up. The whole universe is Christian Science. The whole universe is the operation of this principle, of this infinite principle. And so the whole universe is, in a sense, the Church of Christ, the structure of truth and love. Whatever rests upon and proceeds from the divine principle, the whole universe proceeds from that divine principle. The whole universe is the phenomenalization, the creation of that divine principle. So let's widen and expand our sense of what Christian Science is, and not think we have to keep it tight and narrow and little and held in those four walls of a church, of a physical structure, of a building, or of an ecclesiastical form, because it's breaking out. Believe me, it's breaking out. And the world will pass us by, will pass by the old-time Christian Scientist and the old-time belief of what Christian Science is. The world moves on, the idea, the principle moves on. Are we going to hang back, hold back to an old form? Well, you can try. You can try. Because you can always go with the principle, or you can dig in your toes and try to resist and resist and resist, but it won't work. And what do we see when we try to dig in the toes and it doesn't work? We see crisis. That's all that a crisis is the tendency to try to hold on to the old form when this is not possible. And so there is a breaking down of the old form, because the new form will come in. It will come in. Evolution is the nature. Evolution is spirit, is a quality of spirit, is the effect of spirit. Evolution is not the evolution of matter. Evolution is the story of the giving way of matter, the falling away of material constraints, the falling away of a limited concept. And so everything has its evolution. And the Christian Science Church has its evolution. That evolution is the falling away of the limited sense of what the Church of Christian Science is. It's the falling away of the limited view that we have of that divine principle. Well, you see, now I don't know where I am. But I'm being myself, and I can't help doing that, and just cooking, huh? Yeah. I love in the preface where she speaks of that divine principle, the divine principle of healing. She says that it is Emmanuel. That's the Christ, isn't it? It is Emmanuel, God with us, God with us. A divine influence, ever present in human consciousness. That's where everything is going on, in consciousness. There's nothing out there. Weren't you always told that? I was taught that from a little child. My mother taught me that as a fundamental lesson in Christian Science, that there is nothing out there, that everything is within you. And you know, when you're little, you try to grasp that, and you can't imagine what that means. But as you grow and mature in the teaching of Christian Science, you begin to understand that all is consciousness, that everything is going on in consciousness, that consciousness determines experience, that human consciousness is a moving thing, a dynamic thing, that it has a dynamic within it. It is constantly changing and growing. And so here she says that that divine principle is Emmanuel. It is God with you. It is that which is ever present in your human consciousness, in the human consciousness. Coming now, as was promised aforetime, repeating itself. She says there's something about repeating itself. repeating. Just think that principle is repeating and repeating and repeating itself. It's the only thing that comes. It's the only thing that is at work on us. What happens when we experience that repetition? Is that a very boring, stale thing? Does that just take us, right to the doldrums where we feel there's nothing new going on? Just that same old principle repeating and repeating itself. Is that what happens? No. No. It's infinite newness. That principle is moving us on, moving us forward, advancing us, bringing us progress, bringing us newness of life. Just as you see in every discipline, that the moment you touch the principle of that discipline, the moment you identify yourself with the fundamentals of that discipline, of that science, whatever science, small s it seems to be, that you are open to the newness within that subject, that you are become a part of the movement of the idea of that principle, that you experience the infinite variety of that subject, the creativity of that subject, the newness of that subject. That's life. Again, we have that wonderful relationship of principle and life. That principle is life. If you want life, if you want a new sense of life, a full sense of existence, get the principle. What was it? Wasn't it Solomon who said, with all thy getting, get understanding? Huh? But you think you want to get this and you want to get that, and we have those periods in our life that we go through where we think we need this and we want that and we want to demonstrate this. If we're Christian Scientists, naturally we want to demonstrate it in Christian Science. We want to demonstrate a job and a home and a family and a car and a good bank account and all that stuff. You see. But Solomon had it. He said, with all thy getting, get an understanding. And we learn from our experiences. We learn from all our experiences, all our mistaken attempts to demonstrate Christian Science, all our attempts to use Christian Science to get what we think we should demonstrate. We learn that what we really need to demonstrate is the principle. What we really need to demonstrate is an understanding of the principle. What we really want is that true church, that true understanding of the structure of truth and love and the principle. So this Emmanuel, this Christ, this Church of Christ is at work throughout the whole of human consciousness. It isn't just at work in the field of Christian Scientists. It's at work in the whole of human consciousness. Individually, in every individual consciousness, therefore collectively, and therefore universally. It's at work consciously and unconsciously, meaning that it is at work whether we are conscious of it or not. If we are conscious of it, yes, it is working. If we are unconscious of it, it is working anyway. This is the nature of the Christ. This is the meaning of the Christ. And so just because a discipline or a certain movement or a certain religion or a certain individual mentality wants to hold back and hang back, refuses to go forward, this doesn't mean that they won't go forward because of that Christ dynamic working in consciousness. So we see the effects of that. We see the effects of progress, the effects of the workings of the true church. Mrs. Eddy knew this. She knew it right from the beginning. She didn't intend her church to be held in a limited form, in a narrow form. And if you research her writings, you find that there. You see that. You see it so clearly, black on white. Look, for instance, in retrospection and introspection, where she tells the story and the evolution, really, of her college and her church. She says there, at a meeting of the Christian Scientists Association on April 12, 1879, it was voted to organize a church to commemorate the words and works of our Master, a mind-healing church without a creed, to be called the Church of Christ Scientist, the first such church ever organized. When I was its pastor and in the pulpit every Sunday, my church increased in members. You hear the different uses of the term church. My church increased in members, and its spiritual growth kept pace. Its spiritual growth kept pace with its increasing popularity. But when obliged, because of accumulating work in the college, to preach only occasionally, no student at that time was found able to maintain the church in its previous harmony and prosperity. She couldn't find someone to maintain that standard, to carry that standard. Examining the situation prayerfully and carefully, noting the church's need and the predisposing and exciting cause of its condition, I saw that the crisis had come. She saw the crisis at that time. At this juncture, I recommended that the church be dissolved. This was her first church. You know that she had two churches, that she organized the church, and she also had the charter for her college, and that then she asked them to dissolve the church. That's what she's talking about here. Only later was the church reorganized, organized again, against her best understanding, against her instructions, and against really her highest wishes. It was reorganized. But she's showing here the quality of the church at that time. She said, at this juncture, I recommended the church be dissolved. No sooner were my views made known than the proper measures were adopted to carry them out, the votes passing without a dissenting voice. This measure was immediately followed by a great revival of mutual love, prosperity, and spiritual power. The true church didn't go anywhere. It was revived. It came out more and more and more. Spiritual power, yes. The history of that hour holds this true record. Adding to its ranks and influence, this spiritually organized church. Spiritually organized. Apparently there is another sense of organization than just the material sense of organization. This spiritually organized Church of Christ Scientist in Boston still goes on. A new light broke in upon it, and more beautiful became the garments of her who bringeth good tidings that publisheth peace. Despite the prosperity of my church, she learned something from it, that material organization has its value and peril, and that organization is requisite only in the earliest periods of Christian history. Think of it. Only in the earliest periods of Christian history. If we feel we have to have that organization, we know that in our own individual development of consciousness that we are in the early periods of development. That as those periods go on, as we develop and evolve, that we see that we do not need the material form of organization. Organization is requisite only in the earliest periods of Christian history. After this material form of cohesion and fellowship has accomplished its end, continued organization retards spiritual growth and should be laid off. Even as the corporeal organization, this thing, the corporeal organization, deemed requisite in the first stages of mortal existence, is finally laid off for the deep structure, see, for the deep structure, in order to gain spiritual freedom and supremacy. From careful observation and experience came my clue to the uses and abuses of organization, she says. And so